Okay, for our sprite object, I'm going to be using an imported object. So first, I need to import the object, and it's called disk billboard. And just going back, one thing I forgot to do, I already had this set up, but when you're importing the object, you can go to the import options and then set the resize. So what I was set it to 50 centimeters. So this object is included. It was in OBJ format. And then we're going to be bringing it to a VOB, or the view object format. So if we take a look at the wireframe, you can see it's just a simple disk, and there are going to be quite a few benefits in this case. We're not going to have to worry about that square effect. If anything any artifacts do kind of show up, at least they'll be somewhat matching to the shape of the sprite and the object. So it's a very low polygon count, 180 polygons. Typically a plane is about, I think it's just one polygon, or two if it's triangulated. The view handles geometry fine, so there shouldn't be any issues there. Now, because we're using an imported object, we can't use the billboard setting of keeping it oriented toward the camera. So we just need to make sure that when we are using the object that we use the particle settings to face it towards the camera and remove any sort of orientation. I'm going to go ahead and just adjust the sun a little bit to be a little more forward facing so we can see the object a little better. So I'm going to just reset my preview to smooth shaded. And this is the selection of textures I'm including for the sprite. Really only I need to use 3 of them. There's some variability for the color. So the alpha and the normal will basically be constant. But you got some different choices for the color maps you want to use for different types of effects. So I'm going to start with the smoke color large map, and I can just drag it onto the object. And we can edit the material. And I'm going to be using, I think, a world standard mode. And then I can define the texture mapping mode, set it to parametric, and then I'm going to set our mapping mode to automatic UV. The UV map for this is just basically a straight projection of just the circle. So it automatically added a blank texture for the alpha. I'm just going to set that to automatic UV, object parametric. And then what I can do is drag the smoke alpha onto that texture map. But really what we want, and we might not need to connect the alpha just yet, we can disconnect that for now. I'm going to connect the transparency to the grayscale output of that. And then we can delete these extra nodes. So there's a render with just the base settings. What I'm also going to do is if we go to the back and we look, we don't really see anything coming through. So what we want to do is also set up a backlight. Now, because of the way the color map is set up, and one of the reasons why I have a color map, extra one, that has the black edge around it, is it'll help with the backlight to remove any edge highlights that'll show up, artifacts basically. But what we can do instead is extract the backlight and connect it to the transparency map. What we want to do is add a filter first and set it to opposite because we need it inverted. And that also kind of darkens it around the edges. And then we can see it showing through. Now this texture map's pretty well defined. There's a lot of variation. And when we have a lot of particles, we might want something a little more uniform. One of the textures that I've got set up has a very bright center on it. I'm just going to show you that one. It's a much lower resolution though. So we can only get so large with it, but it does work for that kind of a smoke puff. So it depends on kind of what you want. And I can show you to the black edged one. Now another thing too, it's usually a good idea to change the gamma. Now I'm working with the gamma correction set to 1.8. It's also modifying my textures to 1.8. So the transparency might not be showing up correctly. And what I want to do is go to this little Y for the projected texture for the transparency and override the gamma to 1. Just to make sure it's showing up properly. So there's with the edge darkened. And it does kind of fade in better. And once we have a whole mess of particles, I think actually that darkened edge will be a lot better when they're overlaying. So there's not really a preview showing up right now. I'm going to set it to the automatic mapping mode, which should automatically go to the UV. Sometimes the automatic mode or the automatic UV mode doesn't give you a display or OpenGL preview. I'm also going to make sure that the texture map has interpolation type set up. It's set to bilinear, which should be fine. It is a very low resolution map, 128 by 128 pixels. It's usually good to work with lower resolution maps for sprites, especially if you're going to have a whole bunch of them. So what we also want to set up is normal mapping, which is one of the main advantages to using an imported object, as opposed to one of the view billboards, because you can't use normal mapping on geometry that isn't baked. And if you bake a billboard, it doesn't work like a billboard anymore. So we might as well just use a more compatible type object, which is why we had this one. So to set up the normal map, we may be able to load it by using import normal map, but Vue sometimes gives errors saying that the object isn't compatible. Usually that's just for Vue objects that have been baked that usually accept normal maps, just not through the interface this way. So we could import it or set it up manually. So you could choose the normal map, and if it works, then you should be fine. Otherwise, I'm going to show you how you can set it up manually if you need to. Because sometimes you'll get an error saying the object isn't compatible, even though it is. The only objects that aren't compatible are unbaked Vue objects. If it's baked, it'll work fine. And if it's imported, it should definitely work. So what I'm going to do is just copy and paste the texture map that I've got set up for the color, just so I don't have to reset up any of the other settings. And I'm going to bring this over to the right, and I'm going to add an output normal mapping. And then I'm going to replace this texture with my normal map. And then all we need to do is add a conversion. So we're going to add a math node. It's not under conversions. Let's see. Vector operations, RGB to normal. And whether or not you want this to use the gamma, system gamma, or the regular gamma, typically you would override the gamma with a value of 1 to get a proper normal map. But with the way that this normal works and how we're modifying the surface, sometimes the system gamma looks a little better. And I'm going to see, and typically we can get a preview. Of the normal. Maybe just automatic mode. And I'm going to set the interpolation type to bicubic for this. And I'm going to go ahead in the atmosphere and just modify the sun and see if the normal is showing. It does look like it is showing up. So if we move to the sun on the side, now we see shading on the side of the object. So it doesn't look just like a flat plane anymore. So that'll give us a lot of detail and lighting effects when using it as a sprite. And with the extra shading, it is really dark around the edges. I want to see just how the other color map's going to look instead. And I might just need to adjust some of the variation and kind of the gamma of it. But I think that actually will look a little better because of the way the backlight is set up, and with the normal, it's going to darken the edges already. So we don't want that happening too much with it. Also, if you want to get a better idea of how the normal is going to work, what you can do is add a point light. And I'm going to decrease the power to 10. And just kind of move that around by the object. And then we can make any modifications we need, or we can see the difference between the gamma settings. So I just want to check the gamma for the normal. And once we have a normal map loaded in, you can't access the function editor through the bump production, so we just need to go through in a different area. I'm going to override the gamma, and what that's going to do is balance it out a little bit more. So that the curvature starts more around the edge rather than somewhat inward, which might work alright. That's why I like to bring a point light in, just to have something else changing the direction of the light and see how that looks. It does lose some of its depth. So I think in this case, actually, I will go back to the system gamma, which is 1.8. We could even raise it higher and increase the intensity. But what I wanted was basically to give this more of a spherical look. And the normal itself is fairly simple. It's basically a modified version of the alpha, inverted, and then scaled a bit beyond the range of the map. And then I used that to create a normal in Photoshop using the XNormal plugin, which is a free normal mapping plugin. Now there are some additional changes I want to make to this billboard, but it's going to be easier to see the output once we have it within a particle system. So what we're going to do is save this object as a particle object. First I'm going to edit the material, and we can give it a name. Let's call it Smoke Bill. And then we can just right click and we can save the object. And to get it to show up in your library, just go to your installation content directory and go to Objects and Particles. And I've got quite a few in here. I'm going to call this Disk Billboard Smoke, and actually I already have one, Disk Billboard, because I did set this up prior. So I'll just throw an AFX in front of it to separate it. And I'm going to go ahead and incorporate the texture maps so they save with it. And just holding down the control key and right-clicking to zoom in a little to adjust the preview. And click OK, and now we'll be able to load that in as a particle. So what I want to set up now is I'm going to add a sphere, and we're going to scale that down. I'm just a little over 1 meter. We're going to edit the material. Actually, first I'll go ahead and right-click, reset the material. And then we can edit it. And we're going to add a layer, ecosystem particles. And I'm going to turn on particle motion before I add the object. In order to avoid scaling changes that are made depending on internal unit, and also it does give you the option to rename the object when you load it in as a particle. So if we select to add the object, and there is that disk billboard, click OK, and it'll give us a pop-up to rename the object if we want to. If we just added it in as a normal ecosystem, we wouldn't be able to rename it. So I could just call this smoke, shorten the name. And I'm going to turn off the fast population mode. And we just want to see how many particles we got here. Now we need to adjust the orientation in order for this to render properly. I'm also going to set it up so that the gravity is reversed and it's pulling it upward. So we're going to start to see some errors in the thin areas, the thin planes, as the object is rotated. So what we need to do is orient this object to face the camera. So we can double click on the object and go to the properties and select always face camera. Now the orientation that's set up from the direction from surface and the rotation settings are going to prevent the objects from facing the camera completely. So even though I have the orientation set, we can still see that they are not rotated correctly. So when you're working with this, what you need to do is make sure that your direction from surface is at 0 and that your rotation is also set to 0. Now we can recompute, and it'll realign them. And now you can kind of see a little more what I was talking about with the smoke being possibly too defined, especially in the center. I might even just modify the texture a little and just lighten that area up so it doesn't look so repeated. But there is a change that we can do within the texture or the material with the particle seed to add a little variation and not have to make any changes. But first what I want to do is set up the gravity. So we go to the particle options, and actually I'll go ahead and set this to 4. And then we'll start to have the objects raise up. And I don't want them to last too long, so I'm going to go to the Death tab. So opening the properties, double click, go to the Death tab and set, let's say, actually we'll go ahead and set it to 4. So after 4 seconds they will get deleted. Might even be able to change that. Bring it down maybe to 3. I'm going to set up opacity variations. So they should fade out over time. We'll do relative to the size variation, and then we'll do a life size variation. Let's go ahead and set it to 2 to begin with, 0.5. We'll see how that looks. That might not be nearly enough. And set it to 3. Maybe even 4, with a variable of 1.5. They are rising rather quickly, so we can get away with a higher number. So for now, to get it to render a little quicker, I am going to disable shadows. So opening the material, you can go to the material tab just to directly access that. I'm going to disable shadows for now. It'll render much quicker. We do lose some of the definition, but the normal map will definitely help define the surface. And actually, I'm going to make a few changes before I render that, because it's going to take a while at the current setting. I'm going to go into the ecosystem, and I'm going to decrease the density down to 5, and then we can either increase the overall scaling, or we can go into the particle itself and modify the scale, because we don't need all that many particles for this to work. So that doesn't look too bad, but we definitely need some variability in the color texture map, because it just looks like a pasted on repeating texture. So what we're going to do is go into the material, and I'm going to edit the function, and a simple thing we can do for this is right-click, add an input node, and add the object instance particle seed. What I also want to do is, this is not a seamless texture, so we need to set the tiling mode for the X and the Y to mirror. And then what I'm going to do is change the image rotation based on particle seed. So every single particle will assign a different rotation value for this texture. So I'm going to need to add a math node, vector operation, decomposer 3, which is going to break that vector that's generated from the object instance particle seed into the individual x, y, and z values and numerics. And I'm going to connect the image rotation to z. And I could just use the default settings, -1000, 1000 should be fine. If you want to rotate within specific ranges, you can set the max and minimum rotation value. Now I'm just going to switch to a preview render. And now we can see a nice bit of variability throughout the texture, or throughout the different particles. It's probably still a little too defined, though. Go ahead and take a look for more of a direct lighting in the front. I might be able to just increase the scale of the texture too, to just focus more on a specific area. So we can try that. Just adjust the scale. We'll set it to 3. And I think that looks better. We could also have a little movement over time if you wanted. What you could do is use, within the texture, we could take the image offset or origin. I think offset tends to work better. And then what we could do is offset let's say the Y, if we wanted it to go up and down. Now keep in mind it is being rotated, so it is going to go in different directions. So in this case, I wouldn't be animating it in that way. But if we did want to set it up like that, if we didn't have this option, what we can do is add vector operation composer 2 and just connect the Y input to time, and then if we connect that to the image offset, what it'll do is offset the image about every second. I did disconnect that time by accident. So just add a little shift. It might be too quick. And keep in mind it won't match with any vectors connected to time in this way unless we divide it by 2, because texture coordinates run from 0 to 1 as opposed to vector coordinates, which are -1 to 1. So we could add a filter, and actually in this case I would divide it a little higher and make it move slower. Actually we'll do 3. Because the orientation, image rotation, this might cause it to move over time in completely separate directions. But it is an extra option you can do. If it's moving slow enough, it shouldn't be that big of a deal, but still have a nice bit of change to it. So I think that definitely looks better than the other smoke preset. The normal map really adds a lot to the shape of the smoke. And there's other modifications we can make as well, make a more advanced function. And by having the normal map, we could even mix different colors in with the normal texture to distort that normal even further and give it different shapes, which is pretty cool when it's set up. If we want to do that, we can just go to the material and we're going to add a blender right after the normal map. Keep in mind, once you do this, you are going to lose any normal mapping preview, but it's not really going to matter in this case. What I want to do is add a noise node, set it to ridged, and we'll have to see about the scale and how big we're going to need it. What I'm going to do is control a color map. So we're going to add a color map, and I'm going to edit it, change the color to blue, so 255 in the blue and 0 for the red and green. And for the other value, I'm going to set it to the midpoint normal, which is 127, 127, 255, or 128, 128, 255. I'm going to connect that to there, and then connect that to the noise. And what we can do is mix the surface. And we can see in the preview, we could also use the zoom, the material zoom, which I did just by clicking on a little magnifying glass. And that'll give us a preview of the normal and how we're changing it. So we can basically bend and distort it in different ways, depending on what functions we're using. You just want to make sure you don't go too far with some of the values. Otherwise, you'll really invert the normal. It looks like maybe I'll just add a little to it, and then scale it up to about 3. 2 or 3, and we'll see how that looks. And then we can also animate that. And if we want to connect it to this instant seed, we could change the origin. So you can see a little more variation in it. We might need to modify the scaling of that noise, but you can make some really interesting looking sprites this way, just manipulating the normal and mixing fractals, just generating different colors to imply different directions of the normal. So we could also start adding other colors in there, the green or red, in order to make effects coming from the top or the bottom or left or right using the red. But just working with the blue channel and making it go in or out works pretty well. We could even go a little further. Just want to make one last modification. And what we could do is mix the transparency with that output directly from the noise. We can set it to max at 1, and we'll see how that looks. And it does add a lot more variability to it, and then it matches up with the normal a little bit more, and can really create some interesting shapes. Now, because we have a world coordinate system right now for this object or this material, what's going to happen is as the smoke starts moving upward, it's going to be rapidly moving through the texture. So what we want to do is kind of lift up the material with the object, and we can do that by creating a little setup here. We can add a vector operation composer 3 and connect the Z to time. So over time it raises the Z origin, and because we already have the origin connected to the instant seed, what we want to do is add a combiner node, set it to add, and then we're going to add that connection to time. So now every second it'll add a value of 1, which for a noise node should work pretty well. If you need to increase the speed, you can multiply the time or set up a map node for it. Now, if we wanted to have the smoke dissipate a little more towards the top, we could also add in an effector and scale it up. And we want to just scale it to basically define the range in which it's active. And then we can double click to open the editor for it, and we can add an effect. So what do we want to do to the particles? We can do a bit of a jitter. We could use the tornado and make them kind of spin a little bit. We could lower them. We could use the attractor to make them kind of move towards the center, or we can use it with an inverted value and make them spread out. We could use the magnet. If I set this magnet and then set the flow to -50, it should be an interesting effect. Actually, it looks like that is way too strong. Let's try -0.1. Looks like magnet's not going to work for that. We could try radial. Maybe that one's not going to work very well for that. Let's try the tornado. And I'm going to increase the angular wind strength and height, and then decrease the flow. And there's a little bit of extra movement in there. And it kind of twists and turns. But we should still have the particles facing the camera from the settings. So unless you're noticing any bad intersections, that looks like it should work okay. So now if we want the smoke to dissipate a little more around the edges, what we can also do is edit the function and connect the alpha to the transparency output. And that should cut it out a little more. And give us a little bit of a better blend. And then we should be able to use shadows more effectively. So I'm going to turn shadows on. Now shadows will definitely increase render time by a lot, but it can be well worth it, and definitely faster than using volumetric materials. Another thing we could do to possibly shorten render time is to make things a little less transparent in some of those dense areas. What we can do is edit the filter for the transparency output and just kind of clip it a little bit in the beginning and the end and cut it out a little more. Now we could also adjust, of course, the amount of particles we have in their lifetime. And another thing we could do is delete the particle if it's at 12% opacity. And for now, I'm just going to remove the effector. And I might need to change that scale of that noise. I think it's a little too large. So what I want to do is I actually want to have an inverted version of the noise. So I'm going to add a filter and set it to opposite before it reaches the blender. So that should look a little better. And then I'm going to decrease the scale to about 1 and see how that looks. I also want to set the Z scale to 0.8 and lower that a little. And we can see the noise a lot more now. It looks a little more interesting. And I still don't see any problems with intersections and the highlight problems that you normally get with the billboards. And there's really nice blends between the surfaces when using the normal method. It's pretty nice. And if you do want to have that noise be part of a main volume, because we do have movement on the Z, we can remove the connection to the instance seed if we don't want that variability per instance, because sometimes it can look neat just by having a single coordinate, which we can see now. It looks pretty interesting. I think I might want to adjust that filter that I set up that cuts it out. Either that or change the density. And maybe add a map. So we could add a filter after the opposite, set it to map. -1 to 1, and then we can adjust the output. I'm going to go ahead and show the blender in the preview so that we can get a better idea of what's going on. So if we don't want to add that much to it, we could just adjust that. We could also change it maybe to a different mode. We could subtract. It can be interesting. just as long as we don't go too far out of bounds, because then what will happen is we'll be subtracting around the edges, which might already be happening. If we change the preview options to 2D plane, we can see it on the edge, and it does look like that's a little too much. So what we could do is raise or cut it out sooner. So at 0.5, I'm also going to clip the out of range values, which I probably should have did before. I also want to change that from value to gradient and set return back on ridged. And that actually does change the output from -1 to 1 to 0 to 1, so we do need to just modify the way it's being clipped. And still, that's not going to work as the subtract mode. If we don't want to use max, we could just modify that. I think I don't need the opposite filter because I can just reverse it with the map. So I'm just going to remove it just to have less clutter. And our output now, 0 to 1. And clip out of range values. We can just modify that a little. Or we can extend the range a little. And just play around with it until you get something you like. And this is really being clipped out now. Just seeing kind of the shape of the noise as the objects flow through it. So different ways you can manipulate it. So it's definitely more interesting than it was, and it really helps break the surface down a little more so it's not so repetitive from the texture maps. I'll go ahead and save this version. And the last thing I want to show you having to do with particle variation is how we can change the color of the smoke over time. So it can start out, if we were to look at it as kind of a color map, we would move through it over time based on the duration of the particle lifetime. So what I want to do is set up kind of a blend with a different color, and then have it changed, or the intensity change over time. It's actually pretty easy to set up. We're going to go into the function. We're starting to get a little dense in here, but overall it's not too bad. It's still a fairly light function. What we're going to do is add a blender. I'm going to add a constant. We could add a constant color. We could also blend it with a fractal, but mainly what I think I want to do is just choose kind of a darker color. And I'm also going to actually remove saturation. So let's just use a dark gray, almost black. And what we could do is have it start out maybe darker and then get lighter over time. We'll try that. So what I'll do is connect input 0 to that constant color, and then input 1 to our current color output. So basically I want to adjust this blender over time. And I don't want to start at 0 because that's just going to be that flat color. So I'll probably start about halfway. So what we want is during the duration of the particle, it will start at 0.5 of a blend, and then 1 when it reaches the end of its life. or maybe a little bit sooner, depending on the blend we want. So go ahead and connect that to the output. And now to control the blender, we need an input node. And what we're going to use is the particle life duration. We might need to use the particle age. One works better for parametric output rather than using the complete value. What we can get is a parametric value that's -1 the birth time of the particle and then 1 at its death. So set up a filter map, and what we want is -1 to 1 to equal 0.5 to 1. Clip the outer range values. Actually, we can do -1 to 0.8 so that a little sooner it's at full blend. Let's see how that's going to work. And actually, I think I want it a little more defined, so I'm going to go back and take the upper value to, say, 0.2. Because we've got a lot of opacity cutting out the lifetime, so we might need to blend it sooner or cut it off a little sooner. Maybe I'll take it in a little bit more. -0.25. And I think I'm going to make it a little darker to start with. So instead of starting at 0.5, let's go ahead and start at 0.2. So we're mostly towards the darker color. And now because of the opacity cutoff, I might need to adjust the life duration. So let's just see how long they're actually lasting. As opposed to the duration amount. Actually, it looks like they're staying almost through the full duration. And I was right. We do need to change that input to particle age. I just modified it and did a quick render. With parametric mode, particle age will properly give you a proper output. Although you might need to adjust the starting point might be 0. I'm just gonna change it to 0 to 0.2 for the input and just see how that looks. Actually, no, it does look like it starts at -1. Just wanted to be sure. So -1 and -0.5. We could have it change fairly quickly. So we'll see them fairly dark on the bottom, and then get a lot lighter towards the top. So that's just an easy way to change color over time. You could also connect a color map directly to that input, and then have one color, say on the left side of the color map, be the start value, and then the right side of the color map would be the ending color value. So that's an easy way you could do it with a color map. If you're not using a texture, or if you're just going to use a color map to blend it. And I think I might make a few modifications to the transparency. I'm going to go ahead and copy the filter and then reset. Oh, actually I reset the function, so I'm going to cancel that. Just reset the filter and see how that looks. Might look a little better now that we made some modifications. It does seem to blend a lot better. So we can increase the amount of particles and get it really dense, or we could remove the impact of that node to the transparency if you really want to fill it in. If you need a faster render, you can turn on or turn off shadows if you don't need them casting on anything, because it really will increase the speed by quite a bit. So I think I'd probably fill this in a bit more, either with more particles or probably changing that transparency mix. And just take a look here. Start at 0. I'm just changing the blender to add. So upper value 0, and then I'm going to raise the lower value to 0.2. So it's just a small amount of subtraction. So that should fill it in more like it was before. And then you could really see the color change over time. And I also want to note the way that we modified the color, you can also use to modify transparency if you want to manually set it up, as opposed to having the evolution tab settings control the opacity. So you could have it fade into the scene rather than just kind of popping into existence, and use that to modify it. I also want to note that this setup does look pretty cool if you use a large size variation, and you get different size particles in there. They move at slightly different speeds because of the mass, and it just gives a lot of variability to the shape of the smoke. That's pretty neat looking. So I'm going to save this scene out as version 3 of the custom smoke. And here's a render with slightly increased density, and then that scaling variation. So not too bad of a look for sprites anyway.